Is God real?
Is God real?
The more I look at the universe, the less convinced
I
I
don't
am.
see any reason to believe
I
that.
believe that God is real and worthy to be trusted.
What actually is the evidence that God exists and we can know him?
What is truth?
Well, our guest today doesn't need an introduction because he is a New York Times best-selling author, personal friend of mine, a friend of Biola, Strobel.
Whatever begins to exist has a cause. We look at the evidence for the resurrection, and then we look at ultimately the gospel.
Lee, I was going to say we'll have you out on when a new book comes out, but I'd have you on anytime. This just gives us an excuse. Your book is called Is God Real? And the obvious question is, why isn't it the case for something? And why did you call your book with a question, is God real?
Well, this is the first time I've ever done a book where I haven't gone to the publisher and said, hey, this is what I feel led to write. I want to do a book on this title. They came to me and they said, we've noticed something technologically, it's very interesting. They said, we've noticed that 200 times a second around the clock, someone on planet Earth is typing into a computer search engine, basically the question, is God real? And I said, oh my goodness, let me do a book on that. Let's address that if there's that much curiosity and interest. And so that's why the title and that's why the approach I took in the book.
Okay, so how's this book similar and different than other books you've written? Case for Christ, Case for Creator, because there's some overlap, but there's also some things that are unique.
Yeah, there's some overlap in the sense that I've drawn from some of my earlier works and a lot of new material as well. But what makes it different is it combines science, philosophy, and history, whereas my previous books kind of focused on each of those. So Case for Christ deals with history, Case for Creator dealt with science, Case for Faith dealt with philosophy largely. And so this book combines all of that and looks at a series of scientific discoveries over the last 50 to 80 years that point powerfully, I believe, toward the existence of God. And then it deals with history. It deals with the question of the resurrection of Jesus, deals with philosophy as well, the moral argument and so forth. And then I deal with the two biggest objections to Christianity, which is if God is real, why is there suffering? And if God is real, why does he seem so hidden? So I've tried to do something that would encourage Christians, that would deepen their own faith, but also prepare them for their kids and their grandkids when they come to them with tough questions and with objections. And frankly, our kids and grandkids are going to be challenged in their faith more than our generation was. There was a guy talking online about his 6-year-old granddaughter who was on the playground of a public school who was being taunted by the other students because she believes in God. Oh, you believe in fairy tales. You believe in make-believe. We got to prepare our kids and grandkids. And so I hope this book will contribute toward that. But also, I hope they give the book away after they read it. Give it away to a spiritual skeptic, a neighbor, a friend, or someone, or a Christmas gift or whatever. Someone who is open-minded and curious about faith. I think this book could be used by God to lead them into his kingdom.
So we're going to take a look at some of the arguments, and I've got some pushbacks for you, probably the kind of challenges that you've considered before. Sure. But essentially, is this book for somebody who goes, all right, man, I love you, Lee. You've got dozens of books. I just want one book that's going to capture the heart of what you do. Is that kind of what this book does? Is that a fair way to look at it?
Yeah, I think it does because it cuts across the grain of all these different disciplines.
Fair enough. All right. So the subtitle of your book is Exploring the Ultimate Question of Life.
Yeah.
Why is the existence of God the ultimate question? What makes that question so much more consequential in your mind than any other question?
Yeah. To me, it is the consequential question. And in fact, you could go to an atheist scientist like William Provine, and he was in a debate with a Christian, and he said, I'll just be honest from an atheist point of view. If there is no creator, then there are 5 things that are true. Number 1, there's no evidence for God. Number 2, there's no life after death. Number 3, there's no absolute foundation for right and wrong. Number 4, there's no absolute meaning to life. And number 5, people don't really have free will.
Wow.
Well, that's an atheist evaluating why this is the biggest, most consequential question of all. If all of those things are true, if there is no God, my goodness, it changes everything.
That's really good. And the distinction I know you make is not that atheists can't be moral, not that atheists can't make choices, but can a naturalistic worldview ground or account for those things, and Will Provine, correctly in my view, says that he can't.
That's right.
All right, so go ahead.
Right or wrong. It's just opinions, it's preferences, rather than a transcendent right or wrong.
So again, we're going to get to the evidence, but how much do you think people are really wrestling with the question of, is God real? Has it increased since the pandemic? Is it different now? Is there any difference from when you first wrote Case for Christ, I think maybe 98 in the late 90s?
Yeah.
Where are we at now with that question?
I'm seeing two trends, and I think they're related. The first trend is there's an increasing number of people in America who do not believe in God. When I was in high school and met Leslie for the first time in 1966, 98% of American adults believed in God.
Wow.
98%. Today, the number is 81%. And then if you press people and you ask them, are you sure? Are you pretty sure that God exists? Only 64% say yes. So we're seeing an increase in that kind of skepticism. But at the same time, I believe that is fueling an increase in people searching for God and searching for answers. Because take a look at Generation Z. Supposedly the first post-Christian generation, a generation where twice as many young people are willing to call themselves atheists as in my generation. Atheism is no longer a dirty word among Generation Z. And yet, what are we seeing as a result of that? Well, the Centers for Disease Control just this year released a study and said that 60% of young female students in America last year experienced persistent feelings of sadness and hopelessness. And this 25% made plans for suicide. 25%.
Jeez.
Now, I was talking to a friend of mine, you may know him, Greg Steer. He's I
love Greg.
Yeah, he's an expert on ministry to young people. And he said, the bad news is that Generation Z is flat on its back, knocked down by sadness, loneliness, and anxiety. But you know what? When you're flat on your back, the only way to look is up. And so because of that, it's caused increased openness to seeking spiritual answers. In fact, another guy you may know, Shane Pruitt, whose ministry is to travel the country and speak to groups of teenagers and college students about God. He said, get this, in the last 3 years, he said more young people begin to follow Jesus Christ than in the previous 18 years of ministry combined.
Huh.
So we're seeing this away, and we're seeing evidence, at various universities of these little pockets of awakening that are taking place and revival that are taking place. So I think the fact that there is an increase in skepticism is fueling this sense of hopelessness. Because if William Provine is right, if there is no life after death, if there is no absolute foundation for right and wrong, if there is no real free will, then my goodness, of course you would feel hopeless. Of course you would feel full of anxiety. And so I think it's causing people to begin to seek more. And that's my hope, that this will eventually result in more people finding faith.
So when I pick up your book, one of the things I see, is God real? I'm thinking, okay, Lee assumes people are asking this question. I didn't know the backstory of how much they were typing it in. And that title is going to hook someone and say, you know what? I have been wondering about that question. I want to know if there's evidence. Now, how do you motivate somebody who kind of goes, you know what, Lee, I don't really care. It doesn't matter to me. It's not that important. I'm happy because of fill in the blank. Yeah. Is it like the rich young ruler where Jesus just lets him walk away and you pray for that person and wait for them to be ready? Or are there things that you have found effective, of course, praying for people, to at least kind of create an itch where somebody goes, all right, I want to know and consider this question and maybe who Jesus is?
Yeah, apathy is a big issue. We're apathetic when things are going okay. I mean, I know times in my life I've been fine, just percolating along and not really praying that much and not really relying on God that much. And then, as you know, about 12 years ago, I almost died. And when the doctor looks in your face and says to you, you're one step away from a coma, 2 steps away from dying, I'm telling you, pray. You pray at that time. So a
Yeah.
lot of young people, they're early in their life. They think they got a whole life ahead of them. Things are going okay. They maybe are falling in love and things are happening. It's tough sometimes to motivate people to ask these deeper existential questions about our existence, our origin, and our future and our eternity. So I think the most effective way is through friendships, through relationships, and just ask questions like, "Hey, Thanksgiving's coming up. Who are you thankful to this Thanksgiving? Are you thankful
It's a
to
great
anybody?"
question.
Or Christmas is coming up. Did you celebrate Christmas as a child? Why did you stop? What motivated you to no longer care? I think to ask questions often generates conversations that we don't expect to otherwise have. A lot of times I like to ask people, I'm just curious, if you could ask God any one question and you knew he'd give you an answer right now, what would you ask him? And often that unveils a what I call a spiritual sticking point in someone's journey spiritually, an objection, a question, or something, and it provides great opportunity for conversations. So I find, especially among young people, they like to talk about what they believe and what they don't believe. You don't have to twist their arm. One of the great phenomena I've seen in the church in recent years are what we call spiritual discovery groups for non-Christians. And, people think it's hard to get people in those groups. No, it's not. It's hard to get people to stop talking. Um, People love these groups. And by the way, 80% of people who join these groups come to faith in Christ.
Amazing.
I think it's a matter of engaging people where they're at, asking them questions that try to unveil what it is that's the spiritual sticking point in their life.
All right, so I got one more question for you before we get to the evidence. I just said there's so many things I want to know that came to my mind reading your book. And let me give a little historical context for this. You obviously know my father. You guys go back decades.
Right.
One of the things I love talking about with my dad is he's 84. Is he's just got this historical perspective of how culture shifted.
Yeah.
And when he started doing apologetics, 60s and 70s, there was an assumption that there was such a thing as truth. We can know it, and we should follow it. The question is, where does the evidence point?
Right.
And the idea also was that the problem is out there in the world. Like Vietnam, there's a problem externally. Now things have shifted much more subjective and internally, that in fact, to not affirm somebody's internal identification and beliefs about themselves is considered a kind of sin today. And we hear people say things like, that might be true for you, Lee, but it's not true for me. Live your truth. So your book, I imagine somebody who's a critic could say, Lee, this is a kind of apologetics book that worked in the 80s and the 90s, but you clearly don't understand that how people perceive truth has shifted.
Yeah.
How would you respond to that? And do you do apologetics differently in any fashion, or does it still work to kind of do it the way you've done it?
Yeah, I think it has shifted over the years, no question about it. And I've appreciated your ministry and keeping your finger on the pulse of how culture is shifting and changing. For instance, as people are asking, not so much, not only is God real, but is God good? That's another question that is on people's minds. But I think it's incumbent on us in a culture that has lost its grip on the definition of truth to wrestle with that and to deal with that and to help people understand it is unlivable and it is illogical to have a culture in which there is no belief in absolute truth. And so what I do in the book is I interviewed a scholar by the name of Chad Meister. Chad, interestingly, used to be one of my volunteers at a ministry at our church in Chicago years ago when he was getting his master's degree. Now he has a PhD and has written 50 books, and it's one of the great philosophers. So I've known Chad a number of years, and one day I was preaching at church on the resurrection, and a guy came up to me later and he said, "Hey, I'm an atheist. What you said is interesting. Can we get together and talk about it?" And I said, "I'd love to, but I'm traveling the next 2 weeks out of the country. Hey, my friend Chad's here." And I pulled Chad over. I said, "Chad will get together with you." so Chad said, "Yeah, absolutely. Come over to my house. We'll have pizza." So before the guy came over to Chad's house, Chad's thinking, how do I talk to him? Because this is a guy, he's a contemporary guy. He doesn't believe in truth. He doesn't believe in the baseline of what I did growing up and so forth. And so he developed what he calls the apologetics pyramid. And he walked this guy through this pyramid when he came over to his house. The pyramid starts at the broadest level, which is exactly what you said. What is truth? And it looks at questions of livability and logic. And it looks at the various permutations of what people think truth is, but then it lands on what truth actually is, which is what is consistent with reality. What is consistent with what we see in the world, and what is actual, and so forth. And so you start at what is truth and you work through that. And so I think that's good for people these days who have misplaced notions about what truth is. But the correspondence theory of truth is truth corresponds to that which is real. And so we go through truth, and then it goes to the next level of worldviews. There's only three possible worldviews. Theism, there is a God. Atheism, there is no God. Or pantheism, everything's God. And again, we apply the tests of livability and logic, and we determine through that, and it's all in the book, that only theism emerges intact. Then we go to revelation. And, God has revealed himself through nature, but also through scripture. And there's various scriptures and various worldviews. And so we look at the reliability of the Bible versus, for instance, the reliability of the Quran. And we establish that the Bible is historically reliable in terms of telling us about Jesus, his teachings, miracles, death, and resurrection. Then we go up further and we look at the evidence for the resurrection. And then we look at ultimately the gospel. So it's a way of working from the broadest question, which is what is truth, which, as you say, is in dispute in our culture, and working toward ultimately what the gospel is. And this guy, they started talking at 7 p.m. at his house over pizza. And by 11 p.m., that atheist was a Christian.
Oh my goodness.
So
Interesting.
we see that God has used this. And so Chad shared this in this book. And I think it'll be helpful for people regardless of where they're coming from.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that, but it makes sense. Like when you wrote Case for Christ, you just launch into your story and the evidence. But here, because people are skeptical of truth, we got to walk through what is truth? Can we know it? How do you discover it? That's a really vital step.